Let's talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve, or the Federal Reserve as it's more commonly known. And so the Federal Reserve operates out of a building, as most institutions do. And that building was built in the 1930s.
Pretty old.
About 100 years old. And there is a renovation that they kicked off, I think 4 years ago is when it was approved, and 3 years ago is when it started. And to be fair, it's going to be really freaking expensive for some reason. It's going to be like $2.5 billion. Now, what do you get for $2.5 billion? I don't know. Quite honestly, I don't care. And the reason why I don't care is because the entire cost of the Federal Reserve's renovation is covered by the Fed itself. It's not an appropriation from Congress. It's not something that U.S. taxpayers are spending money on. It is paid for out of the Fed's operating budget, which is provided through different fees that they charge to banks and interest that's earned, and so on and so forth. So it's not something that I particularly care about because I'm not paying for it. Neither are you, neither is Tucker, neither are any of you listening. And ultimately, this is not something that really should matter. I mean, look, if the Fed wants to renovate itself, like, fine, I don't really care. Do I think it's, a waste of money? Probably, but the building's 100 years old, so whatever. Jay Powell, do your thing. But what I can tell you is this is something that, as of last week, we now have multiple members of the Trump administration talking about potential mismanagement of this renovation project as something that could be leading to a for-cause firing of Jay Powell.
Yeah. Either, the way it's being phrased is either you are mismanaging the project or you lied to Congress about the project itself. I have doubts that Jay Powell is very directly involved in the renovations of the...
You don't think he's GC in the thing?
I don't think so. But nonetheless, it is being brought up as a potential reason for removal for cause, which I think would still probably end up in the Supreme Court, but would pass a lot more muster than just a general removal by the president.
So let's talk a little bit about this, because the last time that we really heard the White House pushing on Powell was probably like late April.
No, I mean, 2 weeks ago we saw the...
No, but in terms of removal.
Oh, in terms of removal, yes.
Yes, like every single day, every week, there's, something in terms of, hey, we'd like to see lower rates. I get that.
Sure.
That's par for the course. That's table stakes at this point.
Yep.
This, I guess where I'm going on this is, I'm not someone who's this unabashed Jay Powell fan.
Sure. We were fairly critical of him at times.
Those of you who have listened to our show for, the last 5 years probably recall a pretty big period from like late 21 through mid-23 where we were, borderline apoplectic at what Powell was doing. I mean, I believe Mark Fandetti famously referred to Jay Powell as...
And if he fails, he'll be one of the biggest monetary wimps in history.
A monetary wimp, which is about as aggressive as you can get from Mr. Fandetti.
Yeah.
Okay?
Failure.
Exactly. That's Mark talking about Jay Powell during that time. He's like, this was not a good job done by Jay Powell and the Fed. But here's where I'm landing at this point, is whether the White House tries to remove Powell for cause or without cause doesn't matter. What matters is the very act of trying to remove Powell if they go that route.
Is it the act of trying, or is it the successful removal that would be most concerning?
No, it's the act. And quite honestly, even... Okay, you want to hear like a real thought that'll wake you up today?
Sure.
You want to hear a real one? Even if they don't get rid of Powell before the end of his term, they've already so compromised whoever the next Fed chair is going to be that next Fed chair does not have any credibility in markets.
That's true.
And
I tend to agree. Yeah,
they will need to, because that next Fed chair is going to be viewed as such a lapdog.
Yeah,
that they're not going to be viewed as having the independence that they typically want to be viewed as.
Yeah, they would need to go with a very outside likelihood candidate for the job at this stage to regain that credibility of that Fed independence at this stage. It'd have to be like a Waller pick.
And
which is not really even in contention.
And here's the thing: Waller would be a freaking fantastic pick. And by the way, fits like a lot of things. Was originally nominated to the Fed board. by President Trump during his first term. So it's not like you're grabbing like some like rando, person who Trump's not familiar with, but you do have someone who's been pretty consistent with his message. And by the way, here's the other thing about Waller. He's been basically right about everything for the last 6 or 7 years.
True.
Like he's got a really good track record recently.
Let's go back to why all this matters, though, Chuck. Why it's so important and what the market reaction not necessarily would be, but could be, I think is where I'm going with this. Because, if you don't get any inflation and you have a lapdog of the president and the Fed, then it probably doesn't matter all that much.
The reason why it matters is because of Brazil, Italy, and other countries of that ilk when it comes to monetary policy historically. I'm not going to put the Argentina one out there because it's quite like the U.S. is not Argentina. But here's why it matters. If you've never spent time looking at kind of emerging economies and their central banks, you're kind of doing a disservice when it comes to central banking, because if there's one thing that you learn very quickly through looking at how emerging economies have to manage their inflation and interest rates, they get forced into certain situations by the market and typically have to be really aggressive with rates in order to maintain credibility. And the reason that it matters is because inflation becomes a problem in those areas really, really easily. And if you don't maintain that credibility, you get absolutely whacked. The idea that, hey, we could just, cut interest rates and, move all the debt short term and that would help us out, I'm sure that the Brazilians have thought of this a few times. I know for a fact the Italians have thought of it a few dozen times. And there's a reason why, as a proud Italian, I look at Italian, monetary policy and its history and Italian, economics and its history, and I go, yeah, we did some really interesting things, back in the Merchants of Venice days, but man, really haven't managed the country well fiscally and monetarily for, pretty much its entire history. So, take some lessons from people who have failed before you. And so when you start talking about a central bank that can lack credibility at the same time that there are a number of institutions looking at where the U.S. could be from an inflation and growth perspective, not just over the next 6 months, but over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, depending on how trade policy is enacted, it raises some real questions about, hey, even if you try to push for lower interest rates, the act of lowering them when you shouldn't can often end up resulting in higher interest rates because the market forces your hand.
Yeah.
Or higher inflation.
I think there is a reasonable and compelling argument that rates, the Fed's own rates right now, should be lower.
Absolutely.
That is a reasonable argument to have
100%.
right now. And it might take 6 months, but they could be proven absolutely correct in that fact.
Completely.
If you have a Fed president, and I have a number of reasons why I think this won't be all that successful, because the Federal Reserve does not rule by president. It rules via a voting system. But if you had a Federal Reserve president, ultimately, who is convincing and successful in lowering interest rates when they really shouldn't, the problems for the broader U.S. economy are far worse than the gains you would get from that.
Yes. So this is kind of where we're heading. It sure seems like there is a movement afoot in the last week to try to make this Fed renovation central to the idea that Jay Powell should no longer be the head of the Fed.
And by all rights, he could have been completely mismanaged, this whole renovation.
Right,
but
I have no clue. Maybe this thing should have cost $8.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I'm not passing judgment on whether the renovation was cost effective or a good idea or this and that, because I have no idea. And the point is, none of us do. None of us are involved in this thing. But it also doesn't have anything to do with Jay Powell's actual stewardship of the Fed. And as such, I can see it for something that, becomes concerning as someone who does believe that Fed independence does matter, not because they're always right. They're wrong quite often, and I'm happy to point out when they are. But because if you don't have central bank independence, I can point you to a laundry list of countries and the problems that have gone on there. And it's unclear.
Including the United States itself, by the way.
Yeah,
1970s, not that independent of a Fed, and we had one of the worst decades for the economy
Things went poorly.
in U.S. history.